In accordance with his latest promises, Monsieur de Flahaut gave me the fullest details of every incident of his daily life. He had attracted the attention of a young woman, rich, independent, and possessing many accomplishments and talents. He was touched by the interest she displayed in him, but his only thought was when he could come to see me, and he had asked for his passport. We do not know how much we demand when we require someone to tell us the whole truth about what he is doing and thinking. These confidences from Monsieur de Flahaut intensified the agitation which filled my heart. It seemed that he could be happy away from me, and might even make a successful marriage. Thus, I became an obstacle to his happiness. What a melancholy thought! Should I not suggest that he pause and examine his sentiments towards me? He does not yet say he loves the other woman. On the contrary, he assures me of his entire devotion. But perhaps he is mistaken? This is what he must make sure of. I wrote him to heed only the promptings of his heart and to pursue only the course which might prove the best for him. He replied that what mattered most in the world to him was to be able to devote his life to me. Yet, while waiting for permission to leave England, he made a trip to Scotland, which allowed him to see more of the young woman who had expressed her liking for him. I studied every indication that might help me understand his sentiments. I so bitterly feared that my heart might be leading me astray. On his return to London, Monsieur de Flahaut informed me that new difficulties had arisen and asked me to obtain him a passport from Bavaria. My brother, whom I asked to do this for me, replied that a Frenchman must apply to his own government and have his request countersigned by the ambassador of the country to which he wished to go. This was the customary procedure, and there was little danger of such a request being refused. If, however, after having tried all these measures, Monsieur de Flahaut still failed to secure his papers, my brother was prepared to try to secure a passport for him. I sent this reply to Monsieur de Flahaut, and I again received renewed expressions of regrets and assurance that the obstacle to the delivery of a passport had not been overcome, but not a word about again renewing his request in Bavaria. On the contrary, his letter concluded, "My friends here believe I am making a great mistake in leaving just at this time." This phrase settled my doubts. I felt that since he submitted to, instead of striving to overcome, the obstacles that separated us, he did not have that affection for me which would replace everything else in his life. I understood that our reunion was a sacrifice he was noble enough to make on my behalf, but which I was also noble enough to refuse. Perhaps, too, this might be best for me. My mind was now irrevocably made up, since I felt that I was to be the only one who would suffer. But where could I hope to find the courage necessary to give up the one thing I cared about? However great our moral strength may be, there comes a time when it must crumble. There is an end to everything, and I felt I had reached that end. Yet I was wrong, since the very sacrifice which I imposed on myself served to stimulate my energy. The passion which filled my heart to overflowing seemed to increase still more in the midst of my efforts to suppress it. Constantly, I was made aware of this depth, and I was terrified to find how completely it absorbed me. Who would help me? Who would defend me in this struggle against myself? I felt that I must write and say that I no longer loved him, that I had given up once for all that affection around which my life had centered for so long. How was I to tell him such a lie? How was I to make him believe I was sincere? There was only one way. It was really to renounce what I had loved so long, to implore the help of God, and promise him to cast off forever that affection which had occupied too great a place in my life. I had been brought up with religious convictions. The discussions I heard in society had shaken my faith. The death of my son had destroyed my trust in Providence. Had I been guilty, I should have accepted my misfortunes. Being innocent, I doubted that God took any direct interest in human affairs. While I still asked him to spare those who were dear to me, I did so from necessity rather than by conviction. One day in Holland, I had the presumption to reply to Abbé Bertrand, who was advising me to follow more closely the teachings of my religion. What can you expect me to say in a confessional? All I could do would be to speak ill of others and well of myself. I here admit that the greatest of my faults was vanity. Proud of my patience in bearing my domestic misfortunes, spoiled by the praise I had received when I was young, I was convinced that I was a person of special merit. Since then, I have discovered my mistake. At the time of which I am now speaking, the uneasiness which filled my heart made my weakness so evident that I could not deceive myself as to my true moral value. Therefore, I did not wish to remain quiescent. From then on, I determined to seek help only in that religion which, while teaching us to love our fellow men, also indicates so clearly the path we are to follow in order never to go astray. How precious it is to find such a guide! If our passions sometimes cause us to abandon him, they also may serve to bring us back to him. In my walks along the highway, I had frequently met pilgrims coming from France and from other far-off countries who were on their way to the famous Abbey of Einsiedeln, situated in one of the wildest corners of Switzerland. I never thought that prayers were particularly efficacious, if uttered in any special locality. But I admired the faith which causes people to undergo fatigue, privations, and difficulties of all sorts in order to obtain that peace of soul which the torments of the world can no longer disturb. Not daring to hope to obtain any such reward, I nevertheless thought that in a spot to which so many persons have come seeking a relief from their troubles, I might find some balm for mine. At such a place, one must be able to find learned, enlightened men, free from those political passions which disturb our times. Perhaps their advice might be beneficial to me. If I chose a spot where the divine presence is frequently invoked and honored, to make my vows renouncing that affection which still dominated my heart, I might hope to have a better chance never to break such a solemn pledge. At the end of October, while the weather was still fine, I drove off in my calash, accompanied only by a single companion. The countryside along the shores of the Lake of Zurich, through which we passed, was most attractive. As I am always influenced by the sight of a lovely landscape, I felt the calm of some gentle melancholy come over me during this part of our trip. But when the mountains rose more steeply, more threateningly about us, when the roar of torrents made itself heard, when the vegetation became more sparse and arid, I was filled with alarm at the thought that I was about to give up the one interest in my life, the only friend I still possessed. I was about to find myself alone, utterly alone. I should not even be able to confide to him the efforts it was costing me to dismiss him forever from my presence. No more should I be able to pour out my feelings into an understanding heart, and it was because I loved him so dearly that I was about to make this sacrifice. Night came on while I was still plunged in these reflections, and when it was time to leave my carriage, I was deeply disturbed in my mind. The silence which surrounded me increased this distress. A French priest came out to meet me carrying a dark lantern. Before conducting me to the apartment which had been prepared for me in the abbey, he wished to show me the church and the miraculous statue of the Virgin, which attracts the unfortunate from such distant points. If objects sacred to but a small number of persons are always impressive, they become still more so amid surroundings which doubtless long before our time were already the scene of those same conflicts, those same sorrows, those same sacrifices. Everything filled me with a feeling of religious awe and impressed me with the consciousness of the solemnity of the step I was about to take. The next day, I appeared fearlessly before a judge I had myself chosen and sought out. Without difficulty, I described my life and my misfortunes, and wholeheartedly forgave all those who had ever done me harm. But when I was told that the sentiment which had too profoundly stirred my heart was a guilty one, since it had separated me from the only love permitted us, the love of our Creator, and that I must banish it completely from my soul, I forgot I had come to implore strength to do this very thing. Sobs choked me, and I fainted. The kindly priest, deeply moved, turned away and waited for me to have regained courage to myself to perform the sacrifice he had demanded. He was right. After having wept copiously, I felt my voice revive, and I promised God to never love passionately anyone but him, and to make him my sole comforter. The venerable priest had at all times been gentle rather than severe. Now I was about to leave. He said, "Ah, Madame, how you have been maligned. In spite of the solitude of this retired spot, English newspapers have reached us. In them, there were statements about you, which I now realize must have been utterly false. Allow me, whenever the opportunity presents itself, to deny such slanders about you. Visitors frequently come here. I shall therefore have the joy of being able to make amends for an injustice which I too committed from ignorance. I should never have thought the newspapers would dare print such lies." "My father," I answered, "while I leave you full liberty to say what you want about me, I know people will not believe you. When political passions run as high as they do nowadays, the truth is of only minor importance." On my return home, I wrote Mr. Duflao. I described how deeply my feelings toward him had made me suffer. My health, my reputation, my happiness, all made it necessary to give him up. I declared that my decision was irrevocable, and I begged him, out of friendship, no longer to think of coming to live with me. How weak is the human heart! Even while I was writing this, I still hoped he would not believe me, that he would perhaps appear and force me to take back all I had said. But such was not the case. In spite of the pain my letter may have caused him, he respected the wishes of the woman who had never deceived him. I would take too long to describe in detail all the tumult that filled my soul. After such violent conflicts, it is natural that much time must elapse before the heart can regain its accustomed tranquility. Even though the most painful moment be past, there are many mornings on which we wake and feel the impress of grief, even before we realize that we are alive. Little by little, the thought of having done our duty comes to relieve the heart of the weight which is oppressing it. We grow conscious of our own powers of resistance, and as we do so, our courage revives and calm returns to us. Only our health remains affected by so many shocks. I suffered from nervous headaches, which kept me in bed for more than a month at a time, headaches which no doctor could cure. As my illness sprang from moral causes, no one was able to supply the one remedy which I needed, namely, complete peace of mind. My ordeal was still too recent. At the same time, my hesitations were at an end. This in itself was a great step forward. A gentle melancholy stole over me. My heart, seeking some outlet, overflowed with tenderness for all those who surrounded me. I dreaded the idea of concentrating my affections on a single being. For all those who have known what love really is must fear the thought of loving again. Thus I attained that peaceful state of mind in which our affection remains quiescent. At times I was conscious of the hatred of certain people. I pitied them for being so unjust and did not resent their attitude. Indeed, I almost sympathized with them, thinking how sorry they would feel when someday they learned that all my life I had been unhappy. Reading those pamphlets in which every conceivable slander was printed about me and which formerly have aroused my indignation, I now said to myself, perhaps in those days I was too vain. I may have considered myself better than those about me. Therefore, I have deserved to be humiliated. Thinking this, I was able to resign myself to what had occurred. It was then that I discovered through my own experience the difference between the precepts of philosophy and the inspired teachings of religion. Philosophy teaches us to be charitable as a means of satisfying our personal pride by the thought that we have done good to others. Religion adds to this spirit of self-satisfaction the secret joy of having served the will of the Almighty. Thus, the philosopher thinks only of himself, the Christian only of God. The former is constantly alone. The latter always has a protector on whom he may call. It is easy to judge which of the two will persevere the longer in the paths of virtue. The person who feels responsible only toward himself will, the day his passions become too acute, give way to them and be unable afterwards to regain what he has lost. He possesses no staff to which he may cling, no firm ground on which he may stand. Such is the fate of the philosopher. But since he, to whom we are bound by our promises, is at the same time the source of all hope, all justice, and all loving kindness, when we fall, we have only to call on him for help, and his all-powerful arm will come to our rescue. This is the joy of being a Christian. These thoughts inspired me every day with stronger confidence in that religion which I had so long neglected, and which so urgently beseeches us to love and forgive our neighbors, that our innate need for loving finds its expression in its teachings. Hence, I could not understand how this religion could be used in France as an excuse for that injustice and hatred of others, which its teachings condemn. I heard from Paris that people were still talking about me. Rumor declared I was hidden in the capital. The Grand Prévôt of the Department of the Seine, when one of his friends asked him about it, replied, "It is not true, but it is as well to let people think so." Monsieur de Cazes was just then the king's favorite, a post which arouses the jealousy of other courtiers. People recalled the fact of his having been at one time my husband's secretary. Without stopping to inquire whether I had been in Holland at the time or not, his enemies, in order to discredit him, spread the report that he had remained attached to my cause and was betraying the king. It was even said I was hiding in his house. The king, who knew the truth, joked him about this, and so I was told afterwards these witticisms did not seem to displease Monsieur de Cazes. One day, Mr. Duval went to see Monsieur de Cazes on a business matter and complained regarding the scandalous pamphlets that were being published about me, pamphlets whose falsity the minister must be well aware of. "What can I do about it?" replied Monsieur de Cazes. "I did not have them printed, and I cannot forbid their being sold. They fit in with our plans. They help discredit those people and keep them out of France. Thus, I constantly served as a pawn in the game of politics, although I once more belonged to the class of those whose lives are anonymous, or at least not made the subject of public criticism, the class where people are loved for their personal merits. I still found myself pursued and tormented until I actually regretted the days when I had been so unhappy, for then at least I had been able to do good to others. Now my presence did them harm. If people wrote me or inquired sympathetically about me, they were annoyed, robbed of their possessions, and imprisoned. Nothing but hate now surrounded me, whereas formerly I at least received marks of apparent affection from those with whom I came in contact. This middle-class life, which I had thought possessed so many charms, only offered me renewed causes for distress. Thus, we are constantly being deceived by our imagination, even when it limits our desires and makes us ask for less than we actually have. Common sense advises us to remain as we are, to resign ourselves to our fate, and to make the most of what lofty and worthy gifts it offers us. Happiness lies in ourselves, rather than in our relations with others. We can lose everything except such satisfaction as we can find in ourselves. Therefore, I realized I must commence to enjoy what I still possessed. I said to myself, if I no longer am very wealthy and able to do a great deal of good, I shall do as much as my means permit. If people accuse me of wicked deeds, I shall console myself by not committing them. If I encounter ingratitude, I shall pity those who have appreciated my kindness towards them. Thus, every day, a new impression led me to that state of resignation which forms the happiness of those who no longer seek for earthly joys. But, as I have already said, it was only by degrees and after much time had passed that such quieting thoughts managed to calm my distress. How often did I still feel my heart overcome by the thoughts of my loneliness? This thought, which was the one I most dreaded, was the one which everything, even the beauty of nature, was constantly evoking before me, despite my effort to banish it. The house I lived in stood on the shores of the lake. The wind howled about it savagely. Terrible hurricanes beat upon it as though they sought to tear it from its foundation. This spectacle of nature's violence was too much in keeping with my state of mind for me to not enjoy it. It seemed to symbolize my life. Come safely into harbor, I now watched the storm and thought of the calm that would follow. But when, following winter's wrath, the gentle charm of spring enveloped the spots where I had hoped to be so happy, the sight of them became more than I could bear. I no longer dared linger among them. I was forced to flee for fear of mourning the illusion I had conjured up there. The need of finding something to drive away the thoughts which I wished to expel from my heart made me more anxious than ever to own a little plot of ground of my own. The court of Baden had forbidden the authorities of Constance to allow me to buy anything there. Consequently, I turned my steps towards Switzerland, and on my drives in that direction looked for some place that might be suitable.